what do you think for any of the listeners were some of the things, if they find themselves sort of operating from those old patterns? That's why you talked about your own attachment patterns as a child, right? Because they impact you and they come alive once you have a kid. You're like, oh, that's the ghosts and goblins under my bed. So what do you think is like a good primer? What kind of helped you really start to move that needle in terms of understanding that the past is actually never behind us? It's always right here, right now, playing out in our life.
Here's the thing for me, I think coming from sports, there's a level of self-discipline that can over at times supersede your own emotional response, right? Like there's another little gatekeeper that's in there. Because you can be competing, let's say, and you're like, I'm uncomfortable, I'm afraid, I don't know that I can, I've got to focus, right? So I think that I utilize that skill to go, because mine is anger. Mine is like, and I don't mean explosive anger. I worry her up, and then my kids see this person that's like, and I learned this as a reflection from one of my daughters. She thinks it's very scary. It's very under control. I don't raise my voice, but it's the worrier up, right? Because it's the fear of vulnerability. It's the fear of intimacy. Like I do that to protect myself. So when I feel that coming up, I recognize and I go, oh, this is super uncomfortable for you, meaning me. And I did this the other night. I was sitting and she was saying something, and I literally put my hand on the back of my neck to like hold myself
Hmm. Anchor.
in two ways, like to tell myself it was okay, but also to hold the war, like to handle it in that like combative way, like, okay, well, like get granular. What do you mean? Let's get the facts straight and all that. So it's completely unproductive. So it was like me recognizing, oh, here I come, and get rid of it, but also recognizing like I'm the adult, I'm not the kid. I really have the desire to be the parent and to act and to show up like the parent. So even if my kids go, my mom, whatever, my one daughter that we've gone through some stuff with, that we're sort of on the other side of it, and like real traumas, said, at least I really appreciate you've always acted like an adult. And I thought, oh, first
Oh,
of all,
wow.
it's a little
That's a
victory, but
huge win.
yes, I have a stepdaughter. I'll give you an example. I have a stepdaughter and she's now 25. When she was 19, I've been in her life her whole life. She's my daughter. And she was kind of being an asshole at 19, like for a minute, like really a couple months. And, in her narrative, I'm the step parent, but I'm really her parent as well. I'm her extra parent. And I'm like, I don't even want to talk to this kid and this and that. And this voice came in my head and was like, you are the parent. So you call, you check, you're consistent. Hey, how are you doing? I love you. And it's just reminding yourself, what are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to achieve? And however that can happen, do that. And get out of your way, like get out of your way. And my 6 and 7 year old self, she's okay. Like it's okay.
Yeah, that's a great description of how we sort of metabolize our past as we mature, right? It's not just behind us. But one of the things that you said that I think is probably the crux of it is this, that your athletics sort of taught you this layer of self-awareness, both mind, body, and psychology, and that allowed you to have the capacity to observe what was happening as it was happening, and that gave you a layer of self-regulation. So anybody out there who's worked with me, you can see that I'm not actually full of shit. I mean, I am, but I'm actually, when I talk about these layers of self-regulation being the crux of everything, it really matters. This is, Gabby is saying, this is how she started to be able to really be present in the moment in a different way.
All right, let me ask you guys both a question on this one. Do you think in a training sequence, if you're working with people as coaches one way or another, do you think you can actually teach the self-regulation stuff first, or do you have to start with, there's this thing people are dying to get better at, right? For that, the athletic pursuit, for Gabby was volleyball. For me early on, it was skiing more than anything else. And a lot of the kind of self-regulation stuff that came up for me like I didn't want to regulate myself until I started to realize that like the voice in my head was getting in the way of what I was trying to do on the mountain, and it was actually putting me in the hospital, right? Like when I started making that, I was like, oh, I got to get control of this, right? So my question is, we often want to teach people self-regulation first before there's the other things, because we know it'll make everything else so much easier. But I wonder if that's actually possible for people. I wonder, because it's so hard and painful to learn the self-regulation stuff. You got to have something you really want, right, that lines up with your intrinsic motivation and your goals and your values, I would guess, before you really, it's the same thing with teaching people grit, right? If I could train flow in any order that I'd want to, I'd train grit before I train flow. But nobody will learn the lessons of grit until they've gotten the drug of flow, because everybody's more than happy to work hard after they've tasted the high. But until that happens, it's hard to do. And I wonder if self-regulation is the same way.
First of all, I think it has to be an internal desire regardless of your pursuit, right? Like I think it actually has to show up for you as a person, because I know plenty of people that are in these situations and it doesn't show up for them. But I don't know. I mean, I would love to hear Sarah's, but I think it's also oftentimes, I mean, for me, it was a survival mechanism that I learned to put in other things. But I think as you venture and you give people a template or concepts that you say, hey, if you go into your personal relationships with this, in your parenting, in your work life, and maybe give them tools so that when they're in that situation, they can practice these concepts, because it's hard to come up with those ideas just on your own. But if someone goes, oh, wait, here, maybe I can try this. And if they get that impact or that result differently, and maybe usually more positively, then they can start to maybe put it that way if they don't have that kind of real pursuit. I don't know.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So what I would say is that it depends. Like, I think, having been decades as a shrink and more recently as a coach, you really have to see where somebody's at when they come in. And you're sort of trying to listen for where they are in the game of self-awareness anyway, and what gets in the way. You're absolutely right, Stephen, that all of us hold these sabotaging patterns, which they are actually, it's like we hold the hand that holds us down, but most of us think it's outside of us. And so, yes, being able to show and highlight those dynamics happening live in the coaching is a fantastic way to deepen that intrinsic motivation. And also, when you talked earlier about the purpose, sort of like, why are you doing this? The good news is I have yet to meet parents who say, I just knew from conception that I wanted to be a shitty parent. Most of us stumble into our foibles as parents because we're just human, and it's a blood sport. And so you usually have a high level of motivation from people, and their purpose is they want to be a better person, to be a better parent. And it turns out that for the vast majority of us, that's an incredible motivator that really sustains people for quite some time. And in general, what I've found is that I think you can do it if you're skilled and you've had enough hours in the chair. You can do these things simultaneously. You can play with where people are at, both building self-awareness, building self-regulation. Gabby's already talked about something that, the observing ego, where you can observe yourself as it's happening. That's a practice. And these are all things that, with both psychological work and then daily behavioral practices, everybody can learn it. It's doable. So it's a great question.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.